Hi, it's Tim Grant.
And Nikki McLeod from the Writing Wrongs podcast.
This episode contains descriptions of an attempted bombing.
Fortunately, in this case, no one was in fact harmed, but it does contain strong language, so listener discretion is advised.
Our discussion will, as always, include an in-depth analysis of how forensic linguistic techniques played a role in unravelling the truth behind these events.
We hope you enjoy the show.
Writing Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics, Series 1, Episode 3, Imposters Tending to the Wild, with Dr Isobelle Clarke.
Hello, and welcome to Writing Wrongs, the podcast from AIFL, the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We're all about improving the delivery of justice through the analysis of language. I'm Professor Tim Grant.
And I'm Dr Nikki McLeod, Deputy Director of AIFL. So, this that we're talking about today, this is one of your cases, Tim, and we've talked about types of cases that forensic linguists get involved in, and obviously we're going to be covering lots of different examples of that. So tell us about this one specifically. How does it fit in? What type of case is this one?
So this case is an authorship analysis case, and in general, authorship analysis is about trying to work out who wrote a particular text. So you're working as a linguist to help an investigative team or help a court figure out who wrote something. Sometimes it's an anonymous text or sometimes it's a text that's disputed. And there's different sorts of questions you can ask about who wrote something. And there's probably two main types of questions, and certainly two types that occur in this case. So the first sort of question you could ask is, what sort of person wrote this text? And we call that sociolinguistic profiling.
So what do you mean by what sort of person wrote this text? What types of things might you be able to comment on?
There's quite a lot of research on different aspects of profiling. So one of the areas might be the gender of a writer. So can you tell from the writing style of a text whether a person is writing in a more female or a more male style?
And can you?
Sometimes, yes. Sometimes. There's also work on a person's education level or professional background. Mm-hmm. So can you tell how educated they are, what their highest level qualification might be? If their writing appears to be from a non-native speaker of the language of the text, so we're looking at English language texts principally. So if someone's writing in English but another language is influencing that English, so say they're a native Spanish speaker, as we'll see, and it might be a possibility in this case, can you tell from the English that the English is affected by their Spanish language, and so on and so forth. So there's a set of questions that you can answer in the profiling sense. What we don't tend to get into is sort of personality profiling. So people sort of from media representations might have seen psychological profilers talking about the motives or the backgrounds or the mental states of offenders. There's round the edges, there's linguists looking at that stuff, but on the whole, that's not what we mean when we talk about linguistic profiling. For authorship analysis, the other sort of task is comparative authorship analysis. So in this kind of task, what you will typically have is some group of texts, or maybe an individual text, where you know who has written it. And then you have a comparison text, sometimes called the query text or the Q text, where you don't know who has written it. It may be disputed or it may be completely anonymous. And you're asking what the likelihood is that they have the same author or are by different authors. So that's a comparison, so that's called a comparative authorship analysis.
So this would be in cases where there may be a suspect or more than one suspect who are potentially the authors of these questioned or queried texts.
That's right. So you might have a small group of people who maybe all live at the same address and share an internet IP address. So the police would be able to identify that, say, abusive message came via that particular property, but there's three people who live in that property. So you could get all the texts that they've written, which you know who wrote which one, and then you've got the abusive text. You're trying to match it up and say it's more likely to be this author than the other two.
Great, thank you. So in terms of this case in particular, you've talked us through what authorship analysis is, and this is an example of one of those cases. Why are we featuring this specific case?
We wanted to talk about authorship analysis in one of these podcasts, but also I think it's a really interesting case because it went on for so long. The case, for as long as I was involved in it, lasted 4 years. And there was a whole variety of different authorship analyses that were carried out over that period of time. And they each had a slightly different purpose. And I think that's quite interesting. I think it's a bit sort of simplistic to think that we only do one type of case to one sort of reason. And there are different factors that come into play here. So it's a long case, different analyses, and also because of the length of the case, and we'll get into discussing this later, by the time we got to the final analysis, I felt that I wasn't working as an independent expert anymore. I was very much part of the investigative team, and that's not the role an expert witness should have.
Right.
Yeah. So for that reason, I invited in the wonderful and brilliant Dr. Isobelle Clarke, who I've worked with before, and she assisted with the case and did the final analysis. And Izzy's joining us in today's discussion.
Dr. Isobelle Clarke was one of the earliest graduates of Aston University's MA in forensic linguistics. I remember teaching you, Izzy. And since then, she's completed her PhD on the linguistics of Twitter with Professor Jack Grieve at University of Birmingham. After this, she moved to Lancaster University for a Leverhulme Fellowship, and she's been researching anti-science discourses as part of her early career researcher fellowship. She's now a lecturer at Lancaster University, and all the way throughout this time she's been working on a number of cases with Tim here, our host. So this wasn't her first foray into casework, but this is obviously the one that we're going to be discussing today. So welcome, Izzy.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, welcome, Izzy. It's great to have you here on our podcast. Before we get into our discussions, let's open the case file.
A little before 8 p.m. in the evening of the 11th of January 2018, a suspicious cardboard box was discovered in a sheltered seat in Princes Street Gardens, a public park in central Edinburgh in Scotland. After a controlled explosion, an inspection showed that it was a viable bomb and could have caused serious harm. There were no clear leads to the identity or the motives of the bomber until a journalist received an anonymous email which linked to Maldición Ecoextremista, a blog from the Mexican eco-anarchist group called Individualistas Tendiendo a lo Salvaje. In English, their name translates to individualist tending to the wild. Their central belief is that the devastation of world ecosystems is linked to scientific and technological progress, and that this justifies direct and sometimes terrorist actions. The email pointed to parallel English and Spanish blog posts, which contained a claim to responsibility for the bomb, including a picture of the interior of the bomb that only the bomber could have taken. Police Scotland sent the blogs to Professor Tim Grant with the question, what sort of person wrote this text? His report concluded that the Spanish version was a translation of the English, but also the style of the English version was influenced by a language other than Spanish. 2 years later, Police Scotland got back in touch, having identified a suspect, Nikolaos Kavanarakis, a Greek national living in Edinburgh. In support of an application for a warrant, Tim provided a further analysis comparing the blogs with text taken from the suspect's website about his rock band, Face of Another. Searchers produced the original blog post from the ITS website, but not the blog claiming of responsibility. The investigation required one final forensic authorship analysis to be carried out to link the authorship of the set of blogs seized from Kavanarakis' computers and the claim of responsibility for planting the bomb. Tim had been working with the police team of investigators for more than 3 years. He was clearly part of the investigation and psychologically was not acting as a wholly independent expert. To avoid bias, Tim contacted Dr. Isobelle Clarke and asked her to perform this final comparative authorship analysis.
So, Tim, this case, as you mentioned, lasted a full 4 years. So before we actually get into Izzy's involvement and how she was able to sort of assist here, can we look at the first two parts of the analysis? So what you carried out first. So this was the sociolinguistic profiling. I said a bit about that, but perhaps we'll go into a little bit more detail. And, of course, the sort of first stage of the comparative authorship analysis. So, yeah, let's just start with what were you asked to do initially?
So my first contact with the case was with Police Scotland, and they outlined the case on the phone to me and said, could they bring me a set of documents? At this stage, it was an open terrorism investigation, so they were very cagey about sending documents over the internet. There was a lot of operational security involved. So they literally came in person down from Scotland to see me and brought a bundle of texts taken, as it turned out, from this Mexican blog site. And these texts were my first look at these ITS blog posts. And each of the blogs that I was asked to look at had parallel text in Spanish and English, which created an initial problem because I don't really speak any Spanish.
We often get this question, don't we? Oh, you're a linguist. How many languages do you speak? And the answer is one, barely.
Yes. Particularly when trying to speak on a podcast, I think I barely manage my native tongue. But I can order a beer in Spanish, and
we can all order a beer in Spanish.
But beyond that, my Spanish is poor. But part of the conditions of taking the case was I couldn't share it with other linguists at this stage, and which is a great shame because we have Spanish-speaking forensic linguists within the Institute who would have been very helpful. But what I was asked was basically the question, can I say anything about the writer of these texts? So it was a profiling case. They couldn't track down the writer through the website. There was, the computer forensic side of things and so on and so forth, all drew blanks. So as a linguist, what sort of person wrote these texts?
Right. So they were having no luck with investigations sort of on the technical side. I guess linguistics was the last hope, I suppose.
Yeah. So quite often what happens in these kind of cases is you've got online texts, and it's sometimes possible to track down the writers through computer forensics and things like that. But quite often the encryption is such, or the indirectness of who posted it is such that there's no direct route to identify the individual poster. And that was the case in this case. So all we have is the language evidence.
Great. Okay, so before we go any further, maybe we should get a flavour of those texts that we're talking about. So we talk about these blog posts, and this is the English version of the text, and it's a claim of responsibility, as you'll hear, for 2 terrorist attacks.
In extreme misanthropic scepticism and experimentation beyond any human notion, I claim nihilistically the following attacks. The arson of 2 minibuses transporting elder people. Why? Why don't you ask the guys from the books you read to tell you why? Oh shit, they're dead? I'll tell you why then. Because I hate old people. A package bomb left totally indiscriminately at a central location selectively.
So after the claim about the package bomb, beneath that there's a photo on the blog post, and that's of the inside of the bomb. Clearly, the only people who will have seen the inside of the bomb would have been the bomber themselves or the police when they recovered the device and had a look at it. So that meant that this was a really credible claim of responsibility for planting that bomb in Princes Street Gardens in Edinburgh. And just to describe the picture for our listeners, it's a cardboard box, and inside that box, in thick black pen, written on the inside of the lid, it says, "Fuck you all." And then there's the device itself, with lots of black duct tape sticking it to the interior of the box and black wires. And that's what the photo shows. So, and it's an accurate photo. It is the photo of the inside of the bomb. And after the photo, the text of the blog says this.
Why do I not think of the innocent people, one might think? I answer with a question. Did my birth giver's pussy think, when it was fucked to be fertilised with microscopic semen that creates the vessels that I hate? Did anybody ask me to be born? Did anyone know what I would become? Do you know that some see consciousness as a curse? Fuck you, pathetic pricks. You don't know shit then. I do not seek justification for existence, neither do I seek someone to blame. I seek the amoral rape of existence through the injection of life passing from the death gate. Anti-human odium is my life's blood, transforming my vessel into the beast.
Okay, and in case we have Spanish-speaking listeners, we have the parallel text here in Spanish, and this is voiced by our PhD student, Neus. Neus is part of our Writing Wrongs production team and a native Spanish speaker, but I have to say here, don't at us for the fact that Neus, the variety of Spanish that she speaks is Peninsular Spanish, and the variety of Spanish in which the blog post is written is South American Spanish. So our eagle-eared listeners may be able to pick out the difference there, but anyway, here's the Spanish version of the text that Sam just read.
¿Por qué no pienso en la gente inocente como uno lo podría pensar? Respondo con una pregunta. ¿Creyó la pucha de mi donante de nacimiento cuando fue cogido para ser fertilizado con semen microscópico que crea los vasos que odio? ¿Alguien me pidió que naciera? ¿Alguien sabía en qué me convertiría? ¿Sabes que algunos ven la conciencia como una maldición? Chínguense, patéticos. Entonces no saben nada. No busco la justificación de la existencia. Tampoco busco a alguien a quien culpar. Busco la violación amoral de la existencia a través de la inyección de vida que pasa desde la puerta de la muerte. Odio antihumano es la sangre de mi vida. transformando mi vasija en la bestia.
So, Tim, those are the texts the police provided you with. What was the first task for you?
So it was clearly a profiling task to come up with anything I could about the writer. Are they giving away anything about their identity through their written style? But as I've said already, I couldn't share the text with my colleagues that actually spoke Spanish. So I had to rely on the research that we've done within the Institute on Spanish, English, what we call interlanguage. So that's how the Spanish would affect the English.
The traces in the English, any evidence there that the native language of the writer might not necessarily be English, but potentially Spanish?
That's right. So we look at things like grammatical structures from one to the other. An example is Spanish is a pronoun drop language, and sometimes Spanish people writing English struggle with the fact that English requires the pronouns to be present in most contexts. So a pronoun was like he, she, I, would be the subject of a verb. So in English, we have to have the pronoun there to explain what is going on with the verb. So I would say, I ask Nikki a question. Whereas a Spanish version, you wouldn't need the I there. The verb contains the information you need. So it would be the translation would be ask Nikki. And you could drop the pronoun, which is why it's called pronoun drop.
So it's a word that replaces names or names of things.
That's right. So when you're looking for interlanguage, the influence of one language on another, what you can see sometimes is these differences in grammar come through. So a Spanish learner of English might have trouble with using pronouns in English. And equally, when an English person learns Spanish, they maybe have too many pronouns that they leave in.
Right. So they might insist on putting pronouns in where a native Spanish speaker wouldn't.
So using these kind of clues, you can then sometimes determine whether a person's English is influenced by a particular language, and in this case, the Spanish. My first question that I tried to ask of the text in this case was the direction of translation. When you look at the text, they're clearly entirely parallel texts. One is a direct translation of the other, and that's really clear when you have the text side by side and you're going through sentence by sentence or even word for word. It didn't take a Spanish speaker to see that, is it?
There were images as well in there, so you could see that there were images were in the exact same place, and then the words came after as well.
That's right. So the image of the bomb that we've already described was above that paragraph that Sam and then Neus read out in the English and Spanish. And that paragraph you could see was exactly the same. Even with my limited Spanish, I could tell that it was exactly the same paragraph. And I looked for direction of translation, so that there's various ways you can do that. You can take very short snippets and you can Google Translate backwards and forwards. You can look up misplaced words from dictionary translations, and so on and so forth. And it seemed really clear early on that the English language text was the original and that the Spanish had been produced from it. I wasn't expert enough to say whether it had been edited by a native speaker of Spanish or whether it was a poor translation, because, like, as I've said, my Spanish wouldn't be good enough to show that. But it seemed to me really clearly that the English was the source text and the Spanish was the translation.
Right.
And then, having established that to my own satisfaction, I then had to account for the fact that the style of the English is, well, I guess the technical term is weird.
I was going to say,
yeah.
So it's a surprise that the English was the source text, given that the English is as you say, kind of awkwardly phrased.
It's very awkward, as well as being pretty crude. It is also strange and elaborate, and there's a lot of intricate language in there which sort of suggests that perhaps it's not a native speaker of English.
Like in the case notes, for instance, with the elder people, normally we would say elderly people.
Yeah, for example, my profile suggested that the direction of translation, that English was the source language, but the source language wasn't influenced by Spanish, but was influenced by some other language. Now, I looked quite hard to see if I could determine what that other language might be. And at this stage, I couldn't come to a conclusion. We've done a series of projects on Slavic languages like Polish and Russian, where there's different grammatical structures that you would find, and it didn't ring true of any of those. And there's a variety of other languages we've looked at. Interestingly, just as a side note, we wrote this up as a paper, and one of the editors of the journal we sent it to was Malcolm Coulthard, who's also a famous forensic linguist. And he wrote back pointing out the spelling of the word nihilistically, or which is presumably for nihilistically, had that CH sound in the middle. And he said that we might have inferred from the CH sound, the K sound in the middle, that came from the Greek alphabet, the letter chi, which is sometimes represented as a capital X, the letter chi and pronounced with that hard K, like in lock in Scottish. That might have indicated to us, had we had the hindsight of, in our paper we'd already told him it was Greek. But anyway, He pointed out there was a clue there that this might have been a Greek writer. But that passed me by. I didn't spot that. So when I wrote my report back to the Scottish police, it wasn't probably that useful to them in lots of ways. And a lot of the reports we do, we have to recognise we can do all the analysis we can, and we've provided a few limited conclusions. Not a native English speaker, but not a native Spanish speaker writing in English.
Right. So you've got to acknowledge the limitations.
Yeah, and that's more or less all I could say.
Okay. So this was the report, and you've mentioned, to be sort of honest about the limitations of the report, what you were able to say, how far you were able to go with those conclusions. So you sent that report to Police Scotland, and then what were the next steps? What happened after that?
I heard nothing for about 2 years, was what happened next. So you send off this report into the void. I mean, they said, thank you very much. And there was a bit of back and forth asking me about my conclusions and so on to get it all straight. But basically, they got back about 2 years later saying that they now had a suspect. I don't know how they had identified the suspect. It was, I think, through international police cooperation, Interpol or Europol or something like that. And the suspect was one Nikolaos Kavanarakis, a Greek national. So Malcolm was right, a Greek national living in Edinburgh.
Malcolm was right after he'd been told.
Yeah, let's get that in case Malcolm listens to this podcast. But so Kavanarakis was a Greek national living in Edinburgh. He was a prime suspect, but there was very little evidence that they had against him. And they wanted sufficient evidence to serve a warrant so that they could seize his devices and see whether there were drafts of these blog posts on his computer at home and things like that. Okay. And what they told me is that they'd been doing what they call open source intelligence work on him as a suspect.
So let's explain what we mean by open source intelligence.
Yes. So what that means is basically they had a name and they searched for all his presence online and anything they could find out about him that wouldn't require the invasion of privacy that would mean you'd have to have a warrant to look at it.
So nothing that requires sort of extra authorization.
No, so if you post anything on the open internet, that's fair game. But if it's in a locked social media account, then you'd have to have a warrant to look inside it.
Right.
Okay? And he had a band, a rock band called Face of Another. And that rock band had a page on Bandcamp, which is a sort of social media music site for people who have bands. And on that page, there were song lyrics and there were small paragraphs about the sort of ideology of the band. And these were the materials that I had then to do a comparative authorship analysis, because Kavanarakis claimed to be the principal writer of the lyrics for the band and of these paragraphs. There was some possibility that another band member might have written some of this stuff.
But the assumption is that he's basically responsible for most of these texts.
So all we've got then is some text which Kavanarakis is more or less known to have written. And then we have the blog posts, which are the queried texts. And we are asking the question, what's the likelihood is that it's the same writer?
So what are the challenges associated with taking on a task like that?
Well, it's a really bad basis for an authorship analysis, okay? Because what you've got lots of problems there. The known texts were really short, and they were snippets, and they were in difficult genres. So one of the things that can easily confound an authorship analysis, can stop an authorship analysis working, is if it's a cross-genre problem. So when we use genre in linguistics, we mean what's the type and purpose of the text? And a song lyric is a different type of text. It's closer to poetry or something like that. And a blog post, as written, these are sort of In this case, there were sort of political manifestos and news stories and things like that. So they're very different text types, very different discourse types. And what we know is when one person writes across different genres, I don't write song lyrics, but if I did, that would be very different from my academic writing. It would be very different from my text messaging. It would be very different from my email style.
Yeah.
So that creates a problem for authorship analysis.
So, I mean, how sort of sure did you have to be in order to give them what they wanted? So that they wanted enough grounds to get a warrant to search his property.
So in Scottish law and in English and Welsh law, what you need to get a warrant is you have to convince a judge to a standard of reasonable suspicion.
Okay.
So it's not. So if you think of a criminal trial, a lot of people have heard of the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes.
And that's a really high standard of evidence, but a reasonable suspicion is obviously quite a lot lower than that.
Yes.
So you don't have to be completely certain. So in the American system, they use the term probable cause. It's a similar sort of level of certainty that we're talking about. That's obviously an advantage because what I did is I did my analysis and I wrote a report and I said, this is quite weak. I have found some features of language and they were little strings of words. We're going to get onto this in a bit, but pairs of words or strings of 3 words together, which were there in the song lyrics and they were there in the blog post. And I was able to show that they were very unusual strings of words that if you Google search for those strings of 3 words, they're very rare. You don't get lots of hits.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and here they were across these 2 sets of documents. And that provided some weight of evidence, which allowed me to say that he was a likely author of the blog posts.
Okay.
And that created reasonable suspicion. But that wasn't the only evidence that they used to serve the warrant.
Okay, so this is getting us on then to what this other evidence was. Are we going to get Izzy to explain what this is? So there was a forensic meteorologist involved in the work that went into getting this warrant being served. And I'm going to just jump over to Izzy. This isn't about your involvement, but it is about a very interesting aspect of the case. Tell us what the forensic meteorologist did.
This is brilliant because I'd never heard of a forensic meteorologist before this case.
I've never heard of a forensic meteorologist.
No, and what had happened is on the blog post there was an image, and then on the band's album there was also another image. Now they were quite similar, taken in the similar areas. Now that could have just been a coincidence, but the forensic meteorologist said that there were clouds within those 2 pictures, and those clouds were probably taken 10 minutes apart, so that did connect them together.
That's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? So that opinion from the forensic meteorologist, along with Tim's report about the comparative authorship analysis work, this all kind of led to the warrant being given. The warrant was authorised. And so the police then discovered lots of texts on Kavanauskas' computers when they conducted these searches. This included ITS blogs, but not the crucial text. So that text that claimed responsibility for the Edinburgh bomb, they did not find that amongst the text on his computers. So there was another analysis left to do. They had the seized materials and they wanted a comparison then with that claim for responsibility for the Edinburgh bomb. So why, Tim, did you invite Izzy in to carry out this analysis?
So by this stage, I'd been working on the case for 2.5 years, caught up in the excitement, but all as you do get, you try to be standoffish and independent as an expert. But, I'd help get evidence against a strong suspect, and there's every sense in which I was no longer an independent expert.
Right.
And one thing we know from lots of research from psychologists and others is that even the most competent and honest forensic scientist across all disciplines, from fingerprinting to DNA and so on, are subject to biases in circumstances like this where they become part of the investigation.
Yeah.
And so it's a really important principle that you shouldn't be part of an investigation. You should be weighing both hypotheses in any analysis you do, that this isn't the person and also that it is the person. So what I needed to do was to find another linguist who could be insulated from all that excitement, from all that prior knowledge, and not tell this new person anything about the case, but just get them to do an analysis as a sort of a clean pair of hands, so to speak. And that's where we come to Izzy.
Izzy, we've heard from Tim about these concerns around bias, and it's stuff that we've talked about this on other episodes of podcasts as well, haven't we? About the dangers of finding what you have been primed to find or that you think you're expected to find and so on. So do you remember what Tim told you, Izzy, about this case when he said he needed your help?
I remember he just said, I've got a case, would you like to help? And I said, yeah, absolutely. But he said, it's an unusual text. And we've got a suspect, and I'm going to give you the set of documents that we know that he has written. Yeah, so I just went through those texts. That's kind of the first step. I said, yeah, absolutely, I wanted to be a part of this. So he gave me the texts, and it was 2 e-magazines or e-zines, and there was lots of different authors within those texts. And you said that the suspect was writing under an alias or a pseudonym called Archigonos. And so it was my task to look at those texts written by them to identify perhaps a habitual style or areas of consistency across the texts that were written by him.
Okay, so we're looking at what we might call the K set, the known documents, so we know where these have originated from. So those e-zines then, what did they look like?
So they were called, the first one was called Paroxysm of Chaos 1, and then the other one was called Paroxysm of Chaos 2. So this Paroxysm of Chaos 2 was the sequel to the first. And they were made up of lots of different sections. I think the first one was made up of about 17 sections and the other one was 13. They had numerous different authors. So Archigonos wasn't the only author writing in them, but there were other authors. Some of them we know to be alive and some of them we know to be dead. They were, again, in this very unusual style. I think they could be best classified as anarchist texts.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what were they doing? Were they sort of manifestos almost, sort of setting out a particular position? Or...
Yeah, arguing for an ideology or talking about, there was something about veganism in there in one of the texts. They were discussing different things, but there was publisher's note written under the first text that was signed by Archigonos. It said publisher's note, and it said, I've selected these texts, not all these texts are kind of written by me, but I selected these texts because not that I agree with everything that's been written, but they've influenced me kind of in some way.
And did you get all the documents at once? Did everything that you needed to look at?
So I got the 2 at one time, and my task was to kind of divide up the text into the different authors and then look at the Archigonos text. Then after I had kind of established an authorial style, maybe of Archigonos, Tim then provided me with the disputed texts.
So you have all these sections, and some of those are written by Archigonos and signed as being written by Archigonos. Mm-hmm. So you have a set of different texts by Archigonos, and what you're looking for is what is consistent in style across those ones known to be by Archigonos.
Yeah.
And trying to get a feel for what his or her authorship style is by comparing across text. And that's when you talk about consistency of authorial style, that's what you're talking about.
Yeah. I'm looking for kind of shared phrases, shared words that are used across all the texts that we know are written by the suspect, so that I can then say, well, this is his characteristic style. And then when I'm provided with the disputed text, if any of those features occur in that, I can then think, oh yeah, maybe this person did write.
So you've created the description of the style that you're looking for before you've even seen that claim of responsibility. And that's the important point to avoid the bias. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the methods you employed? So how did you go about describing the style?
So I used what is called an engram analysis. Engrams are sequences of words or characters. So, for instance, with the sentence, the cat sat on the mat, a 2-word, we call it a 2-gram or a bigram, that would be the cat sat on the mat. They would be all the 2-word sequences, and then we look at 3-word sequences. So the cat sat on. I'm not going to go through them all. Well, that's what we're here for days. And so research into engrams suggests that these can be really helpful to indicate kind of characteristic features of specific authors, and importantly that kind of collections of engrams. So it's not just individual engrams that are characteristic of authors, but that collections of engrams can be used to discriminate between different authors as well. Yeah.
So just to be clear, you're not sitting there with your highlighter pen. So there's some computational technique involved in this.
Yeah. So this is all done through computer analysis, where initially divide the text into the individual n-gram length. So if it was just single words, so 1 grams, I would split the text up into individual 1 grams and then do the same for bigrams, trigrams, and then I would kind of collate them to see.
So if we take trigrams as an example, so sequences of 3 words, the cat sat, yeah? Well, I can count to 3.
Fair enough.
The cat sat. What you do using the computer is you generate every single one of those across the text. Yeah. So you're not picking and choosing things. Oh, that one looks a bit unusual. You just create all of them.
Yeah.
Have you used these in other cases or in other work, forensic or otherwise?
Yeah, I use these actually in the majority of cases that I've worked on. As you said, these can be really helpful in the immediate exploration of the data. It allows me to not cherry pick things. It allows me to really kind of just explore what is used, what kind of n-grams are used consistently across the different texts, so which ones occur quite frequently. And then if they occur frequently, I can then explore, are they distinctive, are they unusual?
What's the particular software that you would use for calculating those lists?
Yeah, I use R, which is a statistical software, programming software. And then I have written code that produces those n-grams for me. And there are certain packages that you can use, though, as well.
Okay, so it's nothing to do with AI?
No, nothing to do with AI.
No, this is just using computers to run through texts, producing these short strings. And so we've got all these sections of texts, and 5 or 6 or 7 of them were assigned by Archigonos. And then you've got these 3-word strings, and you're looking for the 3-word strings that might be repeated within each text. So there's a frequency within the text, but crucially also across the different texts by Archigonos.
Yeah.
So you're able to say this particular structure of 3 words, it occurs in 4 of the 6 texts that you've got to piece or something like that.
Yeah.
The paper that the peer review have got out, Tim and Izzy, that's hopefully going to be out soon, is called Imposters Tending to the Wild. Obviously, this is a play on individualists tending to the wild, the name of the organisation. But what does this imposters bit mean? What does that actually refer to? I understand it's something to do with method.
Yeah, so this is about the imposters method.
Which is what?
The imposters method is best conceptualised as a linguistic version of a police lineup. There are different kinds of levels of similarity to the disputed text, and it's producing a set of imposter texts and then comparing the imposter text to the disputed text and then with your suspect. And it's based on which out of the imposters and the suspect is most similar to the question document. The key to the general imposters is the development of the set of imposters. There are 3 different kinds of types. There's like a fixed set, there's an on the fly, and then there are ones that are matched for genre as well.
With the imposters method, you mentioned that there's varieties of it. There's the fixed method, and there were a couple of other varieties that you talked about. Can you explain those in terms of the lineup analogy?
Yeah, so the first was the fixed set of imposters, and that would be like if I went outside and I just picked 10 random individuals off the street, no matter what ethnicity or gender they were. The next set is on the fly, and this is a set of plausible imposters. So this would be individuals that perhaps are matched for the suspect's height and ethnicity. And then the final one is shared genre. So if this was a person, this would probably be them matched for maybe that they were Greek or something like that. As we know that Karbinakis was Greek, maybe it would be a Greek individual.
When we move back to the text, what you're trying to do is find texts that are close enough in some sense to provide useful imposters, useful distractors, to see whether the claim text is more similar to the known text than the imposters or not. So can we recognise this claim text as being similar given this range of other texts? That's essentially the general imposters method.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially, is our suspect more similar to the disputed text than our plausible or shared genre set of imposters?
It's a slightly artificial method, but it's a way of determining the likelihood of a similarity between the known and the queried text. And the way we're describing the text is through these n-grams. And I think what you decided to do was develop the general imposters method. So the version that you did wasn't on the fly, it wasn't fixed, but something that we came to call the specific imposters method. Yeah. And that was to do with the sort of the community which the texts were drawn from. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so as I said, the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2 were quite unusually written. The style was quite unusual. They were all kind of characterised as anarchist texts, and the disputed text was very unusual as well. It was an anarchist kind of ideology that was going through it. So we decided that we would use the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2, all the texts from it. So we had Archigonos as our known suspect, but there were other authors within the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2, so they were our set of imposters. And they were a very specific set of imposters. All the texts were produced in this e-magazine, so they were kind of the same genre. There was poems in there as well, so there was a variation of genre, but they were produced in this e-magazine, and they also had this kind of anarchist style, that they were within this kind of community of like-minded writers.
In terms of our lineup, we've got a ready-made group of people who we believe are similar across a range of criteria, like their ideology, the topics they're writing on, to some extent the genres they're writing on. So by calling it a specific imposters method, what we're saying is that this is specific to our known text and our query text. So these are a close bunch of writers, and that's useful to us in terms of this method.
Yeah, that's right.
So we've already said how unusual the style of these blog posts are. We heard them earlier. The other feature, though, isn't just that sort of genre of writing, it's the fact that we now know that Kavernakis is Greek. Mm-hmm. And so did you use any Greek imposters, or did you use a different method to try and examine sort of the Greekness of the text?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe take a step back. What we did first of all was we extracted all the engrams. So now we had, through the specific imposters method, we extracted all the engrams from all of the texts, including Archigonos' known text, but also the other authors in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2. So we got all the engrams from all of those for all the different lengths. So 1 grams, 2 grams, 3 grams, 4 grams, and 5 grams. We stopped at 5 grams because the longer the shared sequences, the less likely you are to find kind of longer strings that are shared.
So we've already said we need the distribution, so you need them to occur more than once.
Yeah.
And if you get 6 grams and 7 grams, they only ever occur once in a text.
Yeah.
So that with 2 or 3 grams, you might get 15, 20, 30 occurrences.
Yeah.
And so you can show that consistency across different texts.
Yeah.
So the longer you go, there's less point.
Yeah. Then we looked across all the texts. We merged all the lists of 1 grams from all the different texts into one big kind of master 1 gram list, and the same for the biograms and the 3 grams and the 4 grams. We then searched through each text, so each of the authors in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2 and the known text, and we said, are any of these in that particular text? So is the biogram in any of those authors' texts? Then we were looking for engrams that did co-occur across the disputed text and Archigonos' text. And then we want to explore whether these are characteristic of perhaps the Greek native language, so perhaps they weren't as distinctive as maybe we thought they were. So in order to do that, we compared it against a large data set of Learner English, and this data set we call a corpus, and it's the International Corpus of Learner English. So corpus compiles lots of different texts, and this is a corpus that's dedicated to texts produced by learners of English, and they have a Greek component within that. So it's Greek learners writing in English. So we explored whether any of those engrams were shared between them.
So just to summarise, I think what you're saying is you were trying to identify the engrams which were typical of Archigonos and none of the other writers in Paroxysm of Chaos, and also not typical of a Greek writer anyway.
Yeah, and so in terms of your sort of conclusions, so how many of these unigrams, bigrams, trigrams and so on did you actually find were shared between your known texts and the disputed one?
Yeah, we found a lot. I mean, we had a lot of texts from Archigonos, but we found a lot that were shared with the disputed text. Out of all the other authors within the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2, Archigonos shared the most amount of shared engrams, and that was across all different lengths. So we had 40 unigrams or one-word grams, 141 bigrams were shared, 97 trigrams, 19 4grams, and 3 5 grams. But these were only ones that were shared between the Archigonos text and the disputed text. So they were exclusive to them. No other author in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2 shared them.
Right. Can you give some examples of those, if you remember?
So we had the human animal, that was a shared 3 gram. We also had the shared 5 gram was unite on the basis of, and these were really distinctive. Even just searching unite on the basis of in Google, it was used so infrequently and rare, there were barely any hits. There was a shared 5 gram that was used consistently between another author in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2. That was Wolfie Landstreicher.
So Wolfie Landstreicher was the name of one of the
Was
other
one
authors.
of the other authors of, in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2.
They all have great names.
Yeah, so Wolfie Landstreicher was another author in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2. There was a shared 5 gram with the disputed text and him. So that to us says, maybe they are a potential author of this text. But when we looked at that 5 gram, it was I don't give a. And that's quite a frequent phrase. If you typed I don't give a into Google, you'll get multiple hits. We realised that whilst, yes, that was a shared 5 gram, but this isn't very distinctive.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's sort of, I guess there's the argument that's been made that, well, anyone can put any words together in any order that they want to at any given time, and it tells us nothing. But actually, we don't put them together in any old order at any time, and we are quite distinctive in that.
Yeah, and it's not just the individual ones. It's the combination of all of that sharedness. As I said, 40 single words were shared across multiple texts of Archigonos' text and the disputed, as well as 19 4 grams, so 4 words, sequences were shared across his known text and also the disputed text. And so you share, there was a lot of sharedness in there.
Yeah.
The other part of that is that those 2 grams, 3 grams, 4 grams, 5 grams weren't used by the others, with the one exception that you've talked about.
Yeah.
So they're exclusive to the claim for responsibility and the writings of Archigonos, and this is the basis of the evidence that they may be written by the same author.
You also gave me the other hypothesis to explore, which was that someone other than Archigonos has written the disputed text. And so that was part of also the specific imposters method, which is that I also explored. So I wasn't just interested in what's shared between the disputed and Archigonos, but I'm also interested in what's also exclusive to the disputed text and the other authors on the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2. There were sharedness, the things that existed in the disputed text that didn't occur in any of Archigonos' texts but occurred in some of the other authors' writings. But when I looked at it more in detail, these kind of phrases and word sequences weren't very distinctive. They weren't as distinctive as the shared diagrams and things were there.
So this is a really important point when you're doing any forensic analysis, is that you've got to consider both hypotheses, both that the evidence, that you would see this evidence if Kavernakis wrote it or if Archigonos wrote it, and what the evidence would look like if some other person, some other credible person wrote it. And so you looked at both sides of that equation.
Yeah.
I'm going to come to hearing some of the conclusions from your report in just a second, but can you just sort of tell us what were your sort of inklings based on those observations that you just talked about?
Yeah, I think based on the kind of the frequencies, perhaps that I'd found about the amount of sharedness between Archigonos' text and the disputed text. So I thought that maybe that it was likely that Archigonos had written the disputed text more so than any of the other authors in the Paroxysm of Chaos 1 and 2.
Right. So turning to the report then, we've got Sam voicing some of your conclusions.
The probability of seeing these language features in the disputed text is high if Kavernakis is the author, and that the probability of seeing these language features in the disputed text is low if someone other than Kavernakis is the author.
So can you explain those conclusions a bit? Because you do not say there Kavernakis wrote it. Why is that?
We don't. We're not supposed to, and we're not allowed to either. It's not our task as an expert to say who wrote the text.
So this is an important point for any forensic expertise where it involves identification evidence. So this would include forms of evidence like fingerprinting or other forms of identification like voice comparison evidence, where you're drawing a conclusion as to the likelihood that the disputed material comes from the same source as the known material. So in this case, if I or Izzy had stood up in court and said our evidence shows Kavernakis has written it, what we would have done then is we would have usurped the role of the jury. We would take the jury's decision from them. We'd have said to them, just believe us because we're the experts. Yeah. What you've got to try and express for the jury is, given your language analysis, what is the weight of evidence that Kavanaakis wrote this? And it will never be absolute. We've talked about there's a high probability of seeing these features, these shared engrams across the known and the queried text, of seeing these features if Kavanaakis is the author. And the probability of seeing features is low if someone other than Kavanaakis is the author. So the idea is that gives the jury an idea of the weight of evidence. Now, we don't, in this method, provide a statistical number on that, but there are other forensic scientists in other forensic sciences where they can express that as something called a likelihood ratio, but we won't go into that quite now. Is this, what's the role of the expert? It's not to say he wrote it.
No, so your role is to equip the jury to make a well-informed decision, not to tell them what decision to make.
So it's sort of equivalent to saying the linguistic evidence is strong, or the linguistic evidence points in this direction, but you would need other evidence as well. Or, you know, if DNA evidence is often very strong.
Yeah, Larry Solon called it the linguistic tour guide, didn't he? So
Yeah.
that's what our aim. We're showing you all the evidence that as a linguistic expert, we're showing you where the evidence maybe points to the areas of similarity and where there are differences as well. And then it's up to the jury to decide.
Yeah.
So that was our evidence in the case. The way we did this was because I had been the primary point of contact with the police, I wrote up the expert report detailing Izzy's contribution, but with the idea that I was the sort of the lead language analyst, with Izzy providing a service to me by doing your language analysis in that sense. So it would be more likely than not that I would be called to court as the expert witness. Now, of course, the defence could have called Izzy had they chosen to do so, but that was how we wrote it up. And what happened in this case is what happens in a lot of cases. So Kavanaakis was presented with the full range of evidence against him, including our report, but it wasn't only our report, it wasn't only the linguistic evidence against him. And he pled guilty to a contravention of Section 57 of the Terrorism Act of 2000.
Which is to do with possession of items and giving reasonable suspicion in the context they will be used for an act of terrorism.
Yes. Yes. And as part of his admission to the police and to the court, essentially, Kavanaakis claimed he did not intend the device to detonate and that it had made it in such a way that it could not have ignited. So although he was pleading guilty to having these materials preparatory to a terrorist offence, he was saying, but it wasn't a viable bomb, it was a fake bomb, it was meant to terrorise but not harm.
But the judge in the case, Lord Braid, said...
The scientific evidence is that even if what you say is true, there remained a potential for explosion due to the potential introduction of a hot filament wire in close proximity to a low explosive substance. For example, if the fuse was not sufficiently well separated from the filament.
Lord Braid goes on to recognise the implications of your analysis, both of you, saying to Kavanaakis that...
Your present position is not consistent with the claim of responsibility which you posted, or at least caused to be posted, on the internet shortly after the device had been found.
And on the 16th of February 2022, Kavanaakis was sentenced to 8 years and 4 months in prison at the High Court in Edinburgh, which took into account his early guilty plea. Izzy, describe your experiences working on a case like this. What were the highs and lows?
I like this case because I learnt about forensic meteorology. I never heard about that. That's a positive. A lot of cases that we do as well is we can't really speak about them. And so this case, we actually are able to talk about it. That's a nice thing that we can do because there were a lot of lessons to be learned, especially about the different standards of proof that were required across the different levels as well. And then as a result, how that influenced the different kinds of analyses that we did and the different kinds of evidence that we could provide.
Yeah. So, I've heard you talk at a few conferences, I think, both of you, about this. And then you've obviously got the paper coming out and so on. So it's a great one to share.
On the negatives, though, I'd say I didn't actually know anything about the case until we filmed for a BBC documentary. I had no idea about the actual details of it. All I'd done is give my evidence to Tim, and I knew nothing what had happened apart from when he was later convicted. But even then, the kind of press release of the case was quite minimal. There wasn't a lot. There wasn't a lot that was given. So I had to really go and do my research before we filmed and before I presented any of this work, because I was just blind to it all.
And of course, that was by design, wasn't it? But I'd not thought of that before you said it when we did that TV thing. So it's, you need a debriefing as soon as, once we've submitted all the reports and it's a done case. You need telling everything that's happened. But it quite often is the case when we do work as forensic linguists is that you submit a report to the police or to some other body. We don't only work for the police. And it may not be used and you won't hear the end of the case. Or they've used it to help identify a suspect and then they've interviewed them and there's a confession, so the linguistic analysis isn't used directly in the case. And very often when we do cases, we just don't find out anymore, I guess.
And even when you do go and give evidence, it's like you say, you just go in and you just provide your kind of little piece of the puzzle, and then you go home and you don't necessarily, you'll hear the outcome probably, but you won't really hear any of the rest of the case. And so you've said that when they filmed for Expert Witness, you looked it up before they filmed. I didn't even know when I've watched the actual episode being screened, there were things that were on there that I had no idea had been part of that case. So yeah, it's a familiar feeling. Do you think that working like the two of you, Izzy, do you think that was a good method, and did that go quite smoothly?
Yeah, despite not knowing anything, it feels so much more. I like this way because it feels more objective. I feel like I am just purely investigating two twin hypotheses. Is this suspect the likely author, or has someone else written this? And we've worked on other cases in the kind of this very similar fashion, and it just feels like we're doing our best to kind of ensure that we are not hired guns, but we're working for the court. We're working to provide kind of an objective testimony.
I'm interested as to whether you've taken other cases on your own or whether you want to.
I've not been to court to give evidence yet and been cross-examined, but largely they're kind of investigatory, so not necessarily of like a criminal context, more private companies. The most frequent case that I get is someone has written an online review and it's negative, and the company want that review to be taken down because perhaps know who the person is, they've been given a full refund or something, but yeah, they're continuing to kind of defame and badmouth that particular company through different kinds of things. So I've had to show that those reviews are the ones that they're questioning are written by perhaps the same person.
Yeah, so those kind of cases can be really common. It's the sort of corporate and civil cases.
Yeah.
And in my experience, only I've done lots of those and have never ever been to a courtroom about those. It's just for the information for the company so that they can take the action against the individual and essentially make the problem go away.
Yeah, essentially my reports have been sent to things like Google reviews, and then Google has then taken down the comment after showing that. But yeah, it's never gone to court. No one's ever been arrested for it. It's just bad kind of word of mouth, and that they just want to get rid of.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much, Izzy, for joining us on this episode of Righting Wrongs. It's been great to revisit this case with you.
Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for also asking me to be a part of the case. I've learnt so much. So.
No, it's always good to work with you. So, if you've got a question about this case or any of our other episodes, please remember you can get in touch with the show via email. Righting Wrongs, WRITING WRONGS @aston.ac.uk.
If you've been affected by any of the themes in this week's episode, please consider contacting the resources in the episode description.
This has been Righting Wrongs, an original podcast series from the Aston Institute for Forensic Linguistics at Aston University. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Goodbye.